He had imagined this moment countless times during the long weeks of recovery. The drive away from the city, the gradual thinning of traffic, the quiet road cutting through fields and trees. All of it was supposed to slow his breathing and calm his heart. This house had always been his escape, a place untouched by deadlines, meetings, and constant noise. He hadn't been here in years, but he remembered it clearly. The weathered gate, the unkempt yard, the silence so complete it almost rang in the ears. That silence was what he needed now, what he expected. But the first sign that something was wrong came before he even turned off the engine. The gate was painted, not peeling blue like before, but freshly coated, the color even and bright. He sat there for a few seconds staring, trying to convince himself his memory was faulty. It wasn't. He stepped out of the car slowly, one hand instinctively pressing against his chest, aware of every beat of his heart. The yard was trimmed. Flowers bloomed where weeds once choked the soil. Windows reflected sunlight, clean and cared for. This wasn't neglect. This was intention. Confusion crept in before anger did. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe the property manager had arranged maintenance, but no one was supposed to be here. No one had permission. As he pushed the gate open, it didn't creak the way it used to. Someone had fixed it. That small detail unsettled him more than anything else. He climbed the porch steps and froze when he heard voices, children's voices, laughter, movement. His heart raced, breath shortening as his body reacted before his mind could catch up. He stood in the doorway stunned, watching a scene that made no sense. A little girl ran across the living room clutching a doll. A baby crawled on a rug he didn't recognize. On his couch sat a woman folding laundry, the room filled with the ordinary sounds of life, not chaos, not vandalism. Domestic normalcy. Shock gave way to disbelief, then anger. This was his house, his refuge, his space to heal. The words came out sharper than he intended, demanding explanations he hadn't prepared to hear. The woman's reaction told him everything at once. Fear, surprise, and guilt flashed across her face. Clothes fell from her hands. The children froze. The baby began to cry. In that moment, the reality hit him fully. This wasn't a random break-in. This was a family. A situation far more complicated than trespassing laws and property rights. His instincts screamed to call the police, to restore order, to reclaim what was his. But his body betrayed him, reminding him of fragility, of the doctor's warnings, of how quickly stress could undo him. The house, once empty and quiet, now pulsed with unfamiliar life, and standing there, torn between anger and confusion, he realized that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be resolved as cleanly or as quickly as he had imagined. She hadn't planned for this to be her life, not the fear, not the constant calculations, not the way every decision now revolved around keeping her children safe for just one more day. When she spoke, her words tumbled over each other, urgency breaking through shame. She explained without embellishment because there was no point pretending. She had been evicted. Her husband was gone. The job she relied on disappeared shortly after. The house had been empty. She needed shelter. Her voice shook not because she expected sympathy, but because she had lived too long without it. She explained how she had cleaned the place, fixed what she could, planted a small garden to feed her children, not to claim ownership, but to survive. The house wasn't a luxury to her. It was a pause between disasters. The man standing in front of her represented authority, stability, and threat all at once. He could end this instantly with a phone call. She knew that. She didn't beg at first, she explained. Begging came later when the weight of her children's fear surfaced. When her daughter asked if they would have to sleep outside again, the word again landed heavier than anything else she said. She spoke of losing her husband not with drama, but with exhaustion. A construction accident. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. Bills didn't pause for grief. Children didn't stop needing food. Landlords only waited so long. Every option closed one by one, until breaking into an empty house felt less like a crime and more like the only remaining door. She promised to leave. She set timelines she wasn't sure she could meet. 10 days, 2 weeks, anything that might buy her children time to sleep indoors. She didn't argue that the house wasn't his. She acknowledged it immediately. Ownership was clear. Her desperation was, too. What she didn't say out loud was how carefully she had tried to disappear within those walls. She kept the house spotless so no one would complain. She spoke softly so neighbors wouldn't notice. She built a routine to give her children a sense of normalcy, knowing it could vanish overnight. As she stood there, clutching her baby while her daughter hid behind her, she wasn't defending herself. She was defending the idea that survival shouldn't be punished when all other paths had been closed. The house had given her children warmth, safety, and a brief illusion of stability. Losing it meant facing uncertainty again. And she had reached the limit of how much uncertainty she could bear. She didn't ask for kindness because she felt entitled to it. She asked because she had nothing left to trade but honesty, and because the cost of being turned away would not fall on her alone. The agreement was meant to be simple, almost mechanical, a fixed number of days, a clear boundary, no expectations beyond coexistence. 10 days was something he could tolerate. 10 days had an end point. He told himself it was temporary, that nothing meaningful could take root in such a short span of time. People didn't change in 10 days. Lives didn't shift direction in 10 days. At most, it would be an inconvenience he endured for the sake of doing what felt minimally humane. The first days passed stiffly. Conversations were short, practical, cautious. Every interaction carried the weight of unspoken awareness. This arrangement had an expiration date. He stayed in his room more than he needed to, convincing himself he was resting, when in truth he was hiding from the discomfort of sharing space with strangers who somehow felt far too present. But time behaves differently when routine sets in. Mornings began with the same quiet sounds, the clink of a spoon against a mug, a child's soft footsteps padding across the floor, the smell of food that wasn't ordered or delivered but prepared with intention. He noticed these things without meaning to. They slipped past his defenses, settling into his awareness like background music. You don't realize you've memorized until it stops. He told himself he was counting down the days, but the numbers blurred. Day 3 felt no different from day 5. What changed wasn't the calendar, but the rhythm of the house. The tension softened, the children grew bolder, their curiosity overcoming fear. The woman stopped flinching every time he entered a room. They learned each other's schedules without discussion, moving around one another with the quiet coordination of people sharing limited space. There were moments he hadn't anticipated, a question asked over breakfast that lingered longer than expected, a laugh that surprised him out of his own mouth. The strange sense of calm that came from not having to decide what to eat, where to go, or who to talk to. Decisions were made collectively or not at all. For someone who had lived by constant control, the simplicity was disarming. He noticed his body responding too. His breathing slowed, the tightness he carried in his chest eased during moments he spent sitting on the porch watching the children play. The doctor's orders echoed in his mind, but for the first time, rest didn't feel like punishment. It felt like permission. What unsettled him most was how easily the days filled themselves. He had expected to endure them. Instead, they unfolded. 10 days stopped being a countdown and started becoming a container, holding experiences he hadn't known he was missing. The woman, for her part, lived those 10 days with a different kind of awareness. Every morning was both gratitude and dread. Gratitude for another day indoors, another day where her children slept safely. Dread because each sunrise brought them closer to leaving. She packed and unpacked the same small pile of papers nightly, calculating possibilities that never quite aligned. She kept her emotions tightly managed, afraid that if she relaxed too much, she would forget the impermanence of it all. Yet even she couldn't fully shield herself. She found comfort in routines she hadn't allowed herself to imagine again. Cooking for someone who wasn't a child. Sitting at a table that didn't feel borrowed for a moment. Watching her children laugh freely, unburdened by the tension she carried inside. She told herself it was dangerous to enjoy this. That attachment would only make leaving harder. Still, enjoyment found her anyway, in small, unguarded moments. In the way the man listened when she spoke. In how he treated her children not as inconveniences, but as people whose presence mattered. 10 days became less about waiting to leave and more about pretending, briefly, that she didn't have to. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where the house crossed a line and became something else. It happened quietly, through accumulation. A chair moved closer to the window because someone liked the light there. Shoes lined neatly by the door instead of scattered. Drawings taped to the fridge without asking permission. The house responded in ways he hadn't expected. Rooms felt warmer, not because of temperature, but because they were used, lived in. The silence he had once craved began to feel hollow during moments when the children were away. He caught himself listening for sounds that weren't there, surprised by the sense of absence. He realized how long it had been since he'd shared space without negotiating power or outcome. In the city, every interaction had an angle. Every relationship came with expectations or leverage. Here, things simply happened. Meals were cooked because people were hungry. Conversations happened because someone wanted to talk. There was no agenda beyond the present moment. The children became the house's pulse. Their laughter filled rooms that had sat dormant for years. Their questions forced him into moments of honesty he hadn't practiced. He found himself explaining things without jargon, without the protective layers he used in boardrooms. Their world was immediate and sincere. They didn't care who owned the house. They cared who showed up. For the woman, the house offered something she hadn't felt since before her loss: continuity. A place where tomorrow resembled today in gentle ways. She tended the garden not because it was impressive, but because it grounded her. Watching something grow under her care reminded her that effort could still lead to results, even if slowly. She treated the house with respect, not because it belonged to someone else, but because it held her children's sense of safety. Every clean surface, every repaired hinge was her way of honoring the temporary sanctuary it provided. What neither of them noticed at first was how their roles blurred. He stopped feeling like a host. She stopped feeling like a guest. The language they used shifted subtly, not your room or my house, but the kitchen, the yard, the table. Ownership faded in daily speech, replaced by shared reference points. The house began reflecting them back to themselves. He saw how little he needed to feel content. She saw how capable she still was, even after everything she had lost. Together, without naming it, they built a version of normal that felt fragile but real. Evenings became something he looked forward to, sitting together without distraction, the children playing nearby, half included in adult conversations. He found comfort in the predictability of it all, in knowing where he would be and with whom. For her, the house became a place where grief didn't dominate every corner. It was still there, quiet and heavy at times, but it didn't define every moment. Laughter existed alongside sadness, hope alongside fear. Neither of them said it out loud, but both felt it. The house was no longer just shelter. It was holding them, shaping them, giving form to a life neither had planned, but both were beginning to imagine. Recovery was supposed to be passive. That was what the doctors said. Rest, quiet, no decisions that required weight or pressure. His body had betrayed him once, and now it demanded obedience. He followed the rules on paper, but his mind didn't know how to slow down. Even in stillness, he replayed years of urgency, contracts signed, nights spent chasing numbers that once felt essential. The heart attack had come without warning, not during exertion, not during stress, but in the middle of a life he thought he had under control. That was what unsettled him most. In the hospital, surrounded by machines that measured every beat, he had felt small in a way success never prepared him for. There was no negotiation with his body, no leverage, no backup plan, just vulnerability. When he arrived at the house, he believed distance would heal him. Distance from people, from work, from responsibility. What he didn't anticipate was that healing wouldn't come from emptiness, but from presence. At first, he noticed the physical changes subtly. He slept deeper than he had in years. His appetite returned without forcing it. The constant low-grade tension that lived in his shoulders loosened when he sat outside watching nothing in particular. The doctor called it recovery, but it felt like something more fundamental was shifting. Emotionally, the process was slower and more confusing. He had built his adult life around productivity, believing usefulness equaled worth. Being still made him confront how much of his identity depended on motion. Without work to anchor him, feelings surfaced that he had deferred for years. Loneliness, regret, an unnamed grief for a life that had been efficient but hollow. The presence of others disrupted his isolation in ways he hadn't prepared for. He couldn't withdraw completely even when he wanted to. The children needed attention, not strategically but immediately. Their needs were non-negotiable and sincere. A spilled drink didn't wait. A question didn't schedule itself. Their world operated on urgency without stress, a paradox he struggled to understand. He found that being needed in small, unremarkable ways affected him more than professional dependence ever had. No one praised him for solving a problem. No one rewarded him for showing up. It was assumed, expected, and strangely that expectation felt grounding rather than burdensome. There were moments he caught himself laughing and felt almost guilty, as if joy were premature, as if his body hadn't earned it yet. He would pause, check his breathing, his pulse, waiting for consequences that never came. Instead, his heart responded calmly, steadily, as though it recognized this rhythm better than the one he had imposed on it for years. He realized how much of his previous life had been lived ahead of himself. Always planning, forecasting, preparing for outcomes that never quite satisfied. Here he lived where his feet were, on the porch, at the table, in the present. The heart that had failed him seemed to thrive on that simplicity, responding not to ambition, but to connection. The children didn't approach him with caution for long. Fear dissolved quickly in the face of consistency. He didn't yell. He didn't leave. He didn't disappear the way adults often had in their short lives. So they accepted him with the matter-of-fact trust children give when someone proves reliable without explanation. They asked questions he wasn't ready for. Why he lived alone. Why his house was so big. Why he didn't have pictures on the walls. Their curiosity wasn't intrusive, it was observational, piecing together the world as they understood it. Each question forced him to confront truths he had avoided articulating even to himself. The girl watched him closely, mirroring his moods. When he was tense, she retreated. When he relaxed, she approached. Her emotional intelligence startled him. He realized how attuned children are to environments adults assume they can mask. The boy, too young for words, communicated through need and response, crying until held, smiling when comforted. His reactions were immediate and honest, without strategy. Bearing through them, he began to see how adults complicate life unnecessarily. Children accepted reality as it was, then adjusted. They didn't dwell on what should have been, they focused on what was happening now. Their resilience wasn't dramatic. It was practical. When hungry, they ate. When tired, they slept. When scared, they reached out. They shifted his understanding of responsibility. It once believed responsibility meant control, planning, predicting, protecting against loss. Watching the children taught him that responsibility could also mean presence. Being there when something went wrong, listening when emotions surfaced, allowing messes to happen, and cleaning them without resentment. Their joy was unguarded. They laughed loudly, cried openly, moved from one emotion to the next without shame. He noticed how often adults police their own feelings, filtering reactions through expectations. The children didn't do that. They felt fully, then moved on. It made him question how much emotional restraint he had mistaken for maturity. He began adjusting his behavior unconsciously, slowing his movements, softening his voice, choosing words more carefully, not because he was trying to impress, but because he wanted to be understood. Children required clarity. They didn't respond to abstraction, they responded to sincerity. In their presence, his priorities rearranged themselves without conscious effort. A phone buzzing went unanswered. A task could wait. Their attention demanded engagement, not multitasking. He realized how rarely he had given anyone undivided attention before, and how powerful it felt to receive it in return. They didn't see him as a wealthy man or a homeowner or someone with authority. They saw him as a person who read stories, who fixed things slowly, who sometimes burned food and laughed about it. That version of himself felt unfamiliar but authentic. Through their eyes, he saw how little of his previous success translated into meaning. What mattered was whether he showed up, whether he listened, whether he cared. The simplicity of those requirements humbled him, challenging assumptions he had built his life around. Their presence didn't just soften him, it recalibrated him. He began to understand that influence didn't come from power, but from reliability. That love wasn't earned through achievement, but through consistency. That healing didn't require isolation, but connection, patience, and the willingness to be seen in moments that offered no applause. Kindness had started as a conscious decision, something measured and contained. He believed he was simply doing the decent thing, offering time instead of money, patience instead of authority. At first it felt safe because it had limits. 10 days, clear rules, clear boundaries. But kindness has a way of ignoring the structures people build around it. It slipped past intentions and settled into habit. He found himself asking if they had eaten, not because he had to, but because it mattered. He noticed when she looked tired and adjusted his tone without thinking. These were small acts, but they carried weight. Each one shifted the dynamic further away from neutrality. The problem wasn't that he cared. It was that caring came with consequences. The more he softened, the harder it became to justify the inevitable ending. Generosity blurred into attachment, and attachment into responsibility. He started questioning his own motives, wondering if kindness had quietly rewritten the agreement without his consent. He told himself he was being practical, that this situation would resolve itself. But his behavior contradicted that logic. He stayed present when he could have retreated. He listened when silence would have been easier. For her, kindness was dangerous in a different way. She recognized it immediately as something she couldn't afford to rely on. Kindness, in her experience, was often temporary, extended in moments of pity and withdrawn when it became inconvenient. Each gesture from him felt both comforting and threatening. Accepting it meant opening herself to disappointment. Rejecting it meant protecting her heart at the cost of warmth she desperately needed. She tried to keep emotional distance, reminding herself daily that this wasn't permanent. She focused on practical matters, searching for apartments, budgeting carefully, refusing to lean too heavily on what felt like borrowed stability. Yet kindness crept in anyway, eroding her defenses through consistency rather than grand gestures. He didn't promise her anything, he simply showed up. Again and again. That consistency forced a reckoning neither of them had planned for. Boundaries that once felt necessary began to feel artificial. Fear crept in, not of losing the house, but of losing what the house now represented. She understood that leaving would hurt more than staying had ever frightened her. The safety she had rebuilt so carefully felt fragile, like something that could disappear the moment she trusted it too much. Running had always been her survival strategy. When things became uncertain, she left before loss could find her. It had worked before, at least in the sense that it kept her moving, but now the cost of running felt heavier. Leaving meant uprooting her children again, forcing them to adapt to another unknown. It meant walking away from something that had begun to feel real, even if temporary. She stood at the edge of a familiar decision, torn between fear and possibility. Staying meant risking pain she warned herself she couldn't survive. Leaving meant choosing loneliness over connection. The instinct to run pulled at her, strong and practiced, whispering that retreat was safer than hope. The shift happened in an instant, the kind that divides life into before and after. What began as a normal day unraveled quickly, tension spreading through the house as worry replaced routine. A child's fever climbed higher despite every effort to cool it, small breaths turning shallow, words losing coherence. Panic stripped away restraint, fear became raw and unfiltered. In moments like that, there was no room for pride, logic, or distance. Only action mattered. He moved without thinking, focused entirely on keeping the child comfortable, present, grounded. She watched helplessly, fear tightening her chest, memories of sudden loss flooding back with brutal clarity. The past collided with the present, reopening wounds she had barely survived. As the hours stretched endlessly, the truth surfaced in quiet desperation. Promises were no longer theoretical. Love was no longer something that could wait. The illusion of control vanished, leaving only choice: stay and risk heartbreak, or leave and live with regret. In the dim light, holding on to hope became an act of courage rather than denial. Love, stripped of fantasy, revealed itself as something fragile and fierce at once. There were no guarantees offered, no assurances of safety, only the willingness to stand in uncertainty together, to choose presence over fear. Love was no longer about protection from pain, but about sharing it, accepting that loss was possible, and choosing connection anyway. The idea of success had once been clear and rigid in his mind. It followed numbers, growth charts, recognition, and distance from uncertainty. Success meant control. It meant security, built from accumulation, insulation from risk, insulation from need. He had pursued it relentlessly, believing that once he reached a certain point, life would stabilize into something permanent and safe. What the heart attack revealed, brutally and without negotiation, was how fragile that structure truly was. All the assets, influence, and planning could not guarantee another morning. They could not sit beside a hospital bed. They could not slow a racing heart in the dark. Letting go of that version of success was not heroic or immediate. It was uncomfortable and disorienting. There were moments when he questioned himself sharply, wondering if he was making decisions based on fear instead of reason. Walking away from ambition felt like betrayal, not just of others, but of the version of himself he had spent years building. Yet each day in the quiet rhythm of the house challenged those doubts. He noticed how little he missed the constant urgency, how rarely he thought about numbers or deals, how quickly his body rejected the idea of returning to that pace. He began redefining success in quieter terms: waking without dread, eating meals without distraction, being present without calculating what came next. Success became something he could feel rather than measure. It showed itself in steady mornings, in laughter echoing through rooms that once sat empty, in the sense that his time was finally aligned with his values rather than consumed by them. For the first time, his days were not dominated by proving something. There was nothing to win, no opponent to outpace. The absence of competition created space for reflection, and in that space he recognized how deeply he had equated worth with output. The shift was subtle but profound. He was still capable, still driven, but no longer defined by productivity alone. Purpose replaced pressure. She watched this transformation with cautious admiration. She had lived too long in survival mode to romanticize change. She understood that choosing a different path did not erase past habits overnight, but she saw sincerity in the way he listened, in the way he adjusted, in the way he prioritized without resentment. His choices did not feel performative, they felt deliberate, grounded in an awareness of cost and consequence. For her, success had never been abstract. It had always been immediate and practical, keeping the lights on, feeding her children, getting through one more week. Watching him willingly simplify his life challenged her assumptions about security. It showed her that stability could be built from presence rather than accumulation, that safety could exist without constant control. Together they navigated uncertainty not as something to eliminate but as something to manage honestly. There was no illusion that life would suddenly become easy. They spoke openly about fears, limitations, and expectations. What they shared was not a fantasy of permanence, but a commitment to effort. Over time, the house reflected this shift. Projects were chosen for function, not appearance. The garden expanded slowly, tended with patience rather than urgency. The pace of life followed natural rhythms instead of artificial deadlines. Even challenges felt different. Problems were addressed without panic, decisions made without haste. He discovered that redefining success did not mean rejecting ambition entirely. It meant redirecting it. His drive found expression in care, in consistency, in building something sustainable rather than impressive. He invested energy in people rather than projections, in the present rather than an imagined future that might never arrive. The house no longer felt like an asset, it felt like an anchor. Not something that held him back, but something that kept him grounded. In choosing a simpler life, he did not feel diminished, he felt expanded, as though parts of himself long neglected had finally been given space to exist. What neither of them expected was how naturally the house began to feel like it belonged to all of them, not legally, not formally, but emotionally. It adapted to their presence, absorbing routines, memories, and shared history. Walls once silent now carried echoes of conversation and laughter. Rooms took on meaning beyond function. Home revealed itself not as a place chosen, but as something formed through repetition and care. It wasn't declared, it emerged. Each morning reaffirmed it quietly. Coffee brewing while someone else stirred. Footsteps overlapping. Light filtering through familiar windows. For her, the idea of home had been fractured by loss. She had learned to treat spaces as temporary, to avoid attachment, to keep emotional bags packed. Slowly, against her instincts, she allowed herself to unpack. She let routines settle. She let her children attach to places and people without constant warning. The children claimed the house effortlessly. To them, home was wherever safety and attention existed. Their ease became a lesson neither adult could ignore. They reminded them that belonging did not require permanence to be real. It required care in the present. Home, they learned, was not something you owned, it was something you participated in. It demanded effort, patience, and vulnerability. It required showing up even when fear suggested retreat. The house had once been empty by design, preserved as a quiet refuge from the world. Now it was full by choice, full of unpredictability, noise, compromise, and connection. And in that fullness it offered something no achievement ever had. What he found was not a replacement for the life he left behind, but a reorientation, a life that made room for fragility without collapsing under it. A life where meaning was not deferred to some future milestone, but lived daily in small, repeatable ways. Home had found him not because he searched for it, but because he stopped running from what mattered. If this story stayed with you, it's because it asked a quiet but powerful question about choice, fear, and what it really means to open your life to others. Stories like this aren't just meant to be watched, they're meant to be felt. And if you felt even a moment of connection, take a second to let us know. Drop a comment and share what you would have done in his place, because your perspective matters here. If this story moved you, tapping the like button helps it reach someone else who might need it tonight. Someone scrolling in silence, looking for hope. And if you believe in stories that go deeper than entertainment, stories about second chances, family, and the courage it takes to choose connection over comfort, then this is your place. Subscribe to the A1 Storyteller channel and become part of a community that values meaning, reflection, and real human moments. There are many more stories waiting for you, each one carefully told to remind us that even in uncertainty, life can still surprise us. And sometimes the next story you hear is the one that changes how you see your own.